The land that emits a deep green hue, Shashya Shyamala, for the crop stands so thick. A verse from our national song, celebrating India's fertility and great crop diversity. It is believed that at one time, India had more than 400,000 varieties of rice, enough to feed a man a new kind every day for his lifetime and for 500 years after that. Farmers of past generations harnessed this great diversity to feed themselves and the growing Indian population. But 4 decades ago, the danger of a great famine changed the way food production and agriculture was seen. A failed monsoon and the resulting fear of large-scale starvation sent panic waves through the nation. A belief that only the explosive yields of some imported miracle seeds would save the country from this crisis led the decision makers to throw caution to the wind. Little did they know that these seeds were accompanied by a retinue of synergistic chemical fertilizers and pesticides without which the promised yields could never be achieved. The traditional varieties were forsaken and a new breed of high-yielding crops were released to swamp the nation's fields. This was the birth of the Green Revolution, and it was hoped that this would save the country from a great disaster. The hybrids performed well, and the remarkable yields in the first few years spurred a complete changeover. The traditional varieties slowly faded into the background. But in less than a decade, the hybrid bubble burst. Yields plateaued, though the inputs of fertilizers and pesticides were constantly increasing. Many of the hybrid crops failed in adverse conditions, and most had little resistance against pests. The farmers found themselves caught in an endless spiral of increased chemical use, decreasing yields, and a deteriorating environment. Some wanted to go back to traditional agriculture. But by then, the worst had already happened. Many of the traditional varieties had already vanished, and those that survived were lost among the minute handkerchief farms spread out over vast areas. For a revival to happen, these lost seeds had to be found and then brought back to life on the chemical-soaked fields. This is the story of a project that began a revolution of a new kind. Countless crop cycles and a changing generation had faded the memories of traditional agriculture. But some farmers still harbored the hopes of reviving the traditional paddy varieties. At the Center for Indian Knowledge Systems, we had been working with the farmers of Valayampattu for almost a year, training them on the methods of organic farming. We were documenting indigenous agricultural systems in Tamil Nadu, and the Valayampattu village was a core study area. Some of the farmers used this opportunity to speak of their desire to revive indigenous crop varieties. And during the course of this discussion, the farmers and all of us present realized that we had converged in our ideas of reviving traditional agriculture. At this point, the first seeds of the biodiversity conservation project were sown. We at the center were only too happy to find an ally among the farmers. Here was a chance to put our ideas into action. After a series of discussions, about 30 farmers resolved to set aside a portion of their lands to cultivate indigenous crops. These would be cultivated only using organic inputs and no synthetic chemicals at all. And it would be ensured that the harvested seeds reached other people who were interested in growing these traditional varieties. On their own initiative, the farmers produced a framework and defined the roles of all those involved. These farmers became the core members of the project and came to be called the Seed Keepers. The center played the role of a silent catalyst, watching and ensuring the smooth progress of the planning stages. We were there to light the flame. It was left to the farmers, however, to build a fire that would light up a great revival effort. The first task of the project was seed collection, and this was a big hill to climb. None of the farmers in Valayampattu had indigenous seeds in quantities that were required for large-scale cultivation. Most had nothing more than a handful to offer. The centre approached government seed banks to see if they could help. Unfortunately, the seed banks only maintained seeds for long-term preservation, and they too had little to offer. The only other option was to seek out farmers who still cultivated the traditional varieties. This was a task simpler said than done. Such farmers were few and far between, and most of them worked at very small scales. Their whereabouts were unknown. An expedition was undertaken to locate such farmers, to speak about this project and then persuade them to give some grains. A team of seed seekers travelled to different parts of Tamil Nadu in what was a landmark effort in crop conservation. At a time when the land was swamped with hybrid monocultures, looking for traditional varieties was like trying to find a needle in a haystack. The seekers had to search down farmers, mostly following clues given by word of mouth. Many of the clues were just dead ends. After 6 frustrating months and meetings with hundreds of farmers, 8 rice varieties were found. Some were given in goodwill and some had to be bought. These precious seeds became the source pool for many of the varieties in the future. Information about the characteristics of each of these seeds was also gathered from the farmers. This was done because the indigenous varieties had their own personalities, the knowledge of which could be useful for other cultivators. For example, Samba Mosanam, a South Indian variety, was well adapted to growing in waterlogged areas. It was ideal for lands that were close to large water bodies and prone to waterlogging. Surprisingly, this variety was also resistant to drought. Similarly, Kalar Pale was well suited to alkaline soil, a condition in which most other varieties could not even survive. Vardan Samba was highly drought resistant and had repeatedly shown its ability to survive through severe dry conditions. These personalities could be used by the farmers to suit the specific nature of their own farmlands. Based on their needs, the farmers had an entire array of seeds to choose from. This freedom of choice was, however, lacking with the hybrid varieties. They grew only under specific conditions, and inevitably, the land itself had to be modified with chemical inputs to suit their needs. Another useful character of traditional varieties was that the grains were viable and could be cultivated generation after generation. The farmers did not have to repeatedly spend money on seeds. On the contrary, the hybrid varieties lost their viability quickly, and the farmers had to keep buying fresh seeds from the market every time. Through the first season, CIKS oversaw the work of the farmers, providing technical inputs and supporting them in their needs. Many of the farmers faced a shortage of organic manure, and CIKS constantly provided them a helping hand. Beneath the harvest sun of 1996, the farmers of Valayampattu reaped their first bounty of indigenous paddy. The harvest festival that year was unique. For the first time after many decades, Pongal, an offering to the gods as thanksgiving, was cooked with indigenous rice. As the festive spirit settled, the farmers got back into business. One of the norms that the farmers had set initially was that they would return twice the amount of seeds they had borrowed from the centre. Almost all the farmers were able to grow enough for themselves and had plenty to return. By this time, the centre had also set up centralized points where the indigenous seeds that were returned could be collected and safely stored. These became the community seed banks. The seeds maintained in the seed banks could then be distributed to other farmers who were interested in cultivating traditional varieties. The formation of community seed banks was an important milestone in the biodiversity conservation project. By spreading out the seeds to different farmers who cultivated them year after year, and at the same time maintaining a safe seed collection, the center ensured that the traditional varieties were safeguarded from some unforeseen disaster which could potentially wipe them out. By now, the word had spread about the successful crop and the economic viability of organic farming. The farmers could see for themselves that indigenous varieties required less input and were robust under adverse conditions. Farmers from neighboring villages began to approach the center for traditional seeds. At this time, the rice market was flooded with high-yielding varieties like Ponni and IR8. This worked against many of the farmers because none of the sellers wanted to stock the indigenous varieties. The hybrid varieties were bright white in color and had a smooth texture which was preferred in the market. In contrast, the traditional varieties were colored and coarsely textured, so the farmers could virtually not sell their crop. This was a big drawback for the project. The center did a preliminary market survey and found that even though only high-yielding varieties were available, some people were still interested in trying out traditional varieties, and more so, organically grown rice. The center decided to start an innovative marketing program through which they could sell the organic rice and vegetables to the public. This program was called Arogyam, which means good health. CIKS campaigned to the public to become members of this group. Arogyam members would get a regular supply of organically grown indigenous products. This not only ensured a market for the traditional varieties, but also gave the farmers much needed monetary returns from their yields. This encouraged the farmers to continue with the traditional varieties and organic farming. Arogyam was able to provide high-quality organic products at a very reasonable cost. For the first time, organic rice and vegetables became non-elitist and reached the middle-class society. Years into the seed conservation project, the center felt the need for a stable setup to operate from. Moreover, many of the seed varieties that the survey team had collected were a mere handful, and these precious seeds had to be grown under protected conditions. The center acquired a piece of land in Anjur and set up a field station. This became the first in-situ conservation center. The In-situ Conservation Center had numerous protected plots in which seeds could be multiplied over many generations and then distributed to farmers. These centers also served as demonstration farms where people could see for themselves the characteristics of many different indigenous varieties. Moreover, the visual impact of the great crop diversity growing next to each other never failed to astound visitors and arouse curiosity among neighboring farmers. The farm was also useful in conducting experiments and gave the opportunity to study and document the characteristics of the different varieties. Anjur became a convenient place for seed keepers to meet and share their ideas and experiences. Through these constant interactions, the seed keepers became a tightly knit group working together as a network. At this time, the center also began to increase its thrust in training programs. The information that was collected in the experimental farm at Anjur and experiences from other areas were packaged and imparted to the farmers through a series of workshops. These workshops trained farmers to use plants available in their fields as fertilizers and for pest control. Farmers were also trained in various composting techniques. This helped them become self-sufficient in their farm inputs and also saved them a lot of money. Outreach programs were also conducted regularly to increase awareness in other sections of the village community. These community-level programs were in the form of essays and oratorical competitions in schools. There was an overwhelming response to these programs. During this period, the center also started producing a series of publications that documented their findings on indigenous rice and also their experiences in organic farming. In 1997, Tamil Nadu had a very late monsoon. The yields that year were drastically affected. Some of the seed keepers were growing both traditional and high-yielding varieties. Both these crops had almost dried out by the time the rains arrived. But when the rains did arrive a month later, a miracle happened. 5 out of the 7 varieties of the traditional crops revived and went on to give a good yield. However, all the high-yielding varieties completely failed. For those farmers who grew only high-yielding varieties, this was an eye-opener. For the first time, they saw for themselves the remarkable capabilities of traditional varieties. The following year, CIKS faced a great demand for traditional seeds and saw a drastic increase in the acreage of traditional paddy cultivation. After many years of working in these areas, CIKS began to realize that indigenous vegetables were also in trouble. Many of them were progressively being lost and were in greater danger of extermination than rice. The modernization of agriculture had brought in hybrid varieties which gave extremely high yields, prompting farmers to immediately switch to them. But as with rice, these vegetables also required high chemical inputs and had low pest resistance. The traditional varieties were slowly pushed to the background. The hybrids were selectively bred for their marketable qualities, and in the process, their nutritional value and flavor were compromised. For example, hybrid tomato varieties had thick skins to prevent damage during transportation. These tasted nothing like the traditional varieties, and their seeds were also not viable. To revive the indigenous vegetables, the center came up with a different strategy. Farming households usually had kitchen gardens where traditional vegetables and medicinal plants were grown for their own consumption. These kitchen gardens were usually maintained by women. After the entry of hybrid seeds, the very concept of kitchen gardens faded away. This was because hybrid seeds had to be bought at a high cost season after season, and the percentage of germination was very low. In addition, hybrids needed constant chemical inputs which most households could not afford. So, most women found it uneconomical to maintain them. The center decided to help the women revive their kitchen gardens by providing them with traditional vegetable seeds. This way, the women could grow their own vegetables and in the process save money and eat healthier food. At the same time, this ensured that the traditional varieties would be conserved. Women were selected for a training program in which they were taught the methods of organic farming and the procedures involved in gathering and processing seeds. Like the rice seed keepers, these women had to grow the vegetables organically and return twice the amount of seeds at the end of the season. Since all this was happening in their own backyards, children also got involved in this project. They helped their mothers in watering the plants and maintaining the garden. They were getting trained in the methods of organic gardening with traditional varieties. Within the first few seasons, the women were saving up to 400 rupees a month by growing their own vegetables. This monetary factor greatly increased the popularity of this project and made it a big success. In Guruvanmeda village, the women folk were so successful that they have become self-sufficient in vegetable production. In fact, many of them did not require seeds from the center anymore and on the contrary became seed suppliers. Now, there are more than 500 households with successful kitchen gardens in the Kanchipuram district. In early 2002, the center had to shift their field station to Sukankollai, a 11-acre farm 25 kilometers south of Anjur. This was a new beginning to their seed conservation effort. The larger land provided more opportunities for experimentation, and the ever-growing seed collection could be effectively propagated and conserved. 8 years after the center began the biodiversity conservation project, they have touched the lives of numerous farmers. Starting with a core group of 30 far-sighted seed keepers, the number now stands at 1,600 farmers cultivating indigenous rice varieties. This effort has spread out to more than 100 villages covering an area of 1,000 square kilometers. However, the greatest success has been in the seed conservation effort. From 8 paddy varieties that were collected after a great struggle, the number now stands at 123. Similarly, 10 vegetable types consisting of 63 varieties have been conserved so far. Enthused by the success of the program, the Center for Indian Knowledge Systems is confident of reviving and conserving many more varieties. The center is also hoping to be able to set up community seed banks in every district in Tamil Nadu to enable easier access to indigenous seeds. Currently, 3 villages have been selected with 40 participating farmers in each. All the farmers will be growing indigenous varieties in their land using only organic inputs. These will soon become model villages which will be completely self-sufficient in their farming needs and demonstrate biodiverse organic farming. What began as a little dream of reviving traditional agriculture has now grown into a large conservation movement. It is hoped that the fire which has been kindled will brighten the green hues of our beautiful land.